The FBI showed up at my ex-husband's Manhattan penthouse at 6:12 on a Monday morning, 6 months after he divorced me for a younger woman, and told everyone I was too emotional to survive without him. By noon, videos of federal agents carrying boxes of financial records out of his building were already all over the internet. The same investors who once worshipped him were calling him a fraud. His new wife had disappeared. His career was collapsing in real time. And the craziest part was that none of it started with the affair. It started years earlier when he convinced me I was weak, paranoid, impossible to love, while secretly hiding money and destroying our marriage piece by piece. The last time he called me before sentencing, his voice was shaking so badly I barely recognized it. He said he still needed me. He still thought I would save him. I did not. My name is Amelia Vale, and this is the revenge story of how the man who humiliated me for a younger woman lost his marriage, his reputation, and eventually his freedom. Chapter 1. The end of my marriage did not happen during a screaming fight. There was no shattered glass, no dramatic goodbye, no moment where I packed a suitcase while rain slammed against the windows of our penthouse in downtown Seattle. It ended quietly, slowly, like something rotting from the inside while everyone outside still thought it looked beautiful. My name is Serafina Vale. I was 37 years old when I realized I had spent most of my marriage making myself smaller so Everett Cole could keep feeling important. That was not how we started. When I met Everett, he was funny and ambitious in a way that made people want to believe in him. We rented a tiny apartment above a bakery that smelled like cinnamon every morning. We sat on folding chairs because real furniture felt too expensive back then. Some nights we ate pizza on the floor while I sketched hotel lobby ideas on grocery receipts, and Everett talked about becoming a financial partner someday instead of fetching coffee for senior executives. Back then, he looked at me like I mattered. One freezing winter night, we sat on the fire escape sharing a blanket because our heater barely worked. Everett kissed my forehead and told me one day he would buy me a house near the ocean so I could wake up hearing waves every morning while I worked. I believed him. The changes started after his promotions. At first, they were easy to excuse. Everett became busier, sharper around the edges, more careful about appearances. At dinners with clients, he started correcting me in front of people, but always with a smile that made it sound harmless. One night, I mentioned a historic hotel renovation I admired in Portland. Everett laughed softly and said, "Serafina gets very passionate about paint samples and throw pillows." Everyone chuckled politely while I stared down at my wine glass, pretending I was not embarrassed. Later, I told him it bothered me. He loosened his tie and sighed like I was exhausting him. "You are too sensitive sometimes, Sarah." That sentence became the soundtrack of our marriage. Too sensitive, too emotional, too dramatic. Eventually, I stopped bringing things up at all. Everett started choosing my dresses before events because certain colors looked less sophisticated. He told me to smile more around investors because people liked warm women. If I talked too long about design at dinner, he squeezed my knee under the table hard enough to make me stop. The worst part was how normal it became. I stopped taking freelance clients because Everett said my schedule needed to stay flexible around his networking events. I stopped wearing bright lipstick because he once said red made me look desperate for attention. I stopped laughing loudly in restaurants. Little by little, I became easier for him to manage. Then came the night that should have mattered to me. I landed my first boutique hotel contract in Seattle, a real contract, the kind I used to dream about before my life started revolving around Everett's schedule instead of my own. I spent all afternoon cooking his favorite dinner, steak with rosemary butter, roasted potatoes, expensive wine I probably shouldn't have bought. Everett came home talking on the phone with an investor and barely looked at me. He lifted one finger telling me to wait without saying the words. So I waited. The food got cold. The candles burned halfway down. Nearly 2 hours later, he finally sat at the table while still checking emails. I told him about the contract anyway because part of me still wanted him to be proud of me. He nodded absently. "That's great, Sarah." I smiled nervously. "They want me to redesign the entire property." Everett rubbed his forehead. "I closed an $8 million deal today. I really don't have the energy to talk about curtain fabrics tonight." Curtain fabrics. That was the moment something inside me folded inward. Not because he insulted my work, because he made me feel stupid for caring about it. I cleaned the kitchen alone while Everett paced nearby talking investments with someone in Chicago. At one point, I dropped a plate because my hands were shaking. He looked irritated instead of concerned. Around that time, I also started noticing small things that didn't make sense. Everett smiling at his phone before locking the screen, text messages he answered in another room, the faint smell of perfume in his car once, something floral and unfamiliar. When I asked about it, he laughed and kissed my forehead like I was ridiculous. "You watch too many dramas." So I convinced myself I was imagining things. By the time I turned 35, our entire marriage revolved around Everett's image. For my birthday, I asked for one thing, a quiet dinner together. That was all. Instead, Everett invited clients and business associates to the penthouse because apparently it was the perfect opportunity for networking before the holidays. Women in silk dresses wandered through my kitchen holding champagne glasses, while Everett laughed by the windows like a politician working a room. At one point, Brielle Mercer walked in wearing a fitted black dress and touched Everett's arm while laughing at something he whispered. I remember how quickly he smiled at her, warmer than he smiled at me. Around midnight, I ended up alone in the kitchen cutting my own birthday cake while everyone else drank champagne outside. Everett came in looking annoyed. "What are you doing in here?" I stared down at the knife in my hand. "It's my birthday." He rolled his eyes. "Don't make everything about you." Then he grabbed more ice and walked back to the party. A few minutes later, he returned without even looking at me and handed me a tray of empty glasses from the living room, like I worked there. I stood in that kitchen so long the frosting started melting over my fingers. That night, I slept in the guest room. I kept waiting for Everett to notice, to come find me, to ask if I was all right. The next morning, he walked past the open door holding coffee and asked if I seen his navy cufflinks. That was it. No apology, no conversation, nothing. Later, I stood in the bathroom staring at my reflection under the soft white lights. My hair looked perfect, my robe looked expensive. From the outside, I probably looked like a woman who had everything. But my eyes looked defeated, not sleepy, defeated. And standing there alone in that giant marble bathroom, I finally understood something that scared me more than being cheated on. I was disappearing, and Everett had become so used to my silence he hadn't even noticed I was halfway gone. After that conversation with Evelyn Granger, I drove back to Seattle feeling strangely hollow, not devastated, not furious, just empty in a way that scared me more than crying would have. The rain followed me the entire drive home. By the time I parked beneath our building, the city lights looked blurry through the windshield, like Seattle itself had started melting around me. I sat in the car longer than I should have, staring up at the penthouse windows. Years ago, seeing those lights used to make me happy. It felt like proof that Everett and I had built something important together. Now it just looked expensive. When I walked inside, Everett was leaning against the kitchen counter with a glass of bourbon in one hand and his phone in the other. The television played quietly in the background, some financial news channel he always watched when he wanted to feel important. "You disappeared all day," he said without looking up. "I went driving." He nodded once, distracted. "Long day tomorrow." Brielle booked 3 investor meetings back to back. There it was again. Brielle. Her name had slipped into our marriage so naturally, it was almost frightening. I opened the refrigerator even though I was not hungry. "Do you ever realize how much you talk about her?" Everett finally looked at me. "Who?" "Brielle." He let out a tired laugh. "Jesus, Sarah, she works for me." That was not what I asked. His expression hardened immediately. You have been acting weird lately. Weird. Not hurt, not lonely. Weird. I crossed my arms. I think most wives would notice if their husband suddenly started smiling at his phone every night. Everett set his bourbon down harder than necessary. Not every woman turns into a detective because her husband gets text messages. I stared at him. I did not accuse you of anything. You implied it. There was always something exhausting about arguing with Everett, because somehow I always ended up apologizing for reacting to things that should have hurt me. That was his real talent, making me question whether my pain was reasonable. Over the next few weeks, the distance between us became impossible to ignore. Everett started taking calls on the balcony late at night. He brought his laptop everywhere, even into the bathroom. Sometimes I would wake up at 2 in the morning and see the glow of his phone lighting his face while he smiled at something on the screen. Whenever I asked about it, he made me feel ridiculous. One night, I rolled over in bed and asked who he kept texting. He sighed dramatically without looking away from the screen. Do you know how unattractive paranoia is? That sentence stayed with me for days. I remember standing in the shower afterward, wondering if maybe he was right. Maybe I had become insecure. Maybe successful men really did live this way. Maybe I needed to be easier to love. That was the cruelest part. I spent months trying to fix myself for a betrayal that had nothing to do with me. At another charity fundraiser downtown, I finally saw how obvious everything had become to everyone except me. Brielle Mercer floated around Everett all night in a fitted cream dress, laughing too hard at everything he said. At one point, she adjusted his tie while they stood near the champagne tower, her hand resting on his chest a second too long. People noticed. I could feel it in the quick little glances women kept giving me before looking away. Humiliation in public feels different from private pain. It makes you wonder how long everyone else has known something your own husband is still trying to hide from you. Near the terrace, I overheard Brielle talking softly while Everett stood beside her. You deserve someone who actually appreciates you. I stopped walking. Everett gave a low laugh. You make me sound trapped. Aren't you? There was no anger in her voice. That was what made it worse. Brielle honestly believed she was the woman saving Everett from a miserable marriage. Then Everett said something that made my stomach twist. Some people stop growing and expect you to stop with them. I knew he meant me. On the drive home, the silence between us felt poisonous. Do you still love me? The question slipped out before I could stop it. Everett gripped the steering wheel tighter. Why do you do this? Do what? Turn everything into an emotional interrogation. I looked out the window before he could see tears forming. Marriage should not feel like auditioning for someone who already promised to love you, but somehow, with Everett, it always did. The next morning, I found myself apologizing because his coffee had gone cold while he spent 40 minutes on a call with Brielle. I actually said sorry before he blamed me. That was when I realized how deeply he had trained me to carry the emotional weight of everything wrong between us. A few days later, I asked if we could leave town together for a weekend. No phones, no investors, no dinners with people pretending to like us. Just us. Everett tightened his watch strap while standing in front of the bedroom mirror. I have a client emergency in Napa. On a Saturday? That's how this business works. I almost laughed because Everett talked about wealth management like he was running military operations instead of babysitting rich people's portfolios. He left before sunrise the next morning. Sunday afternoon, while sorting dry cleaning, I found the hotel receipt inside his blazer pocket. Luxury suite in Napa Valley. Dinner for two. Champagne service. Couples massage. For a second, I could actually hear my heartbeat. When Everett got home that evening, I placed the receipt on the kitchen counter between us. What is this?
His face changed instantly. "Why are you digging through my things?" I stared at him in disbelief. "That's your response? It was a client trip. With a couple's massage? You're becoming paranoid again." There it was. Paranoid, emotional, sensitive. Everett had trained me for years not to trust my own instincts. That night, after he fell asleep, I pulled my old portfolio case from the closet in the guest room. Dust covered the edges. Inside were sketches from years ago, boutique hotels, restaurants, coastal homes filled with sunlight and color and life. The pages looked more alive than I felt. I sat on the floor flipping through them while tears rolled down my face. Not loud crying, just quiet grief for the version of myself I abandoned trying to keep Everett happy. The truth finally arrived on a gray Sunday morning when rain hammered against the windows hard enough to sound like static. Everett left his laptop open on the kitchen island while he showered upstairs. A message flashed across the screen. "I miss you already. Last night was perfect." My body went cold. The coffee spilled across my hand, burning my skin, but I barely noticed. I touched the trackpad before I could stop myself. The messages stretched back for months. Hotel photos, private jokes, plans for a future together. Then I saw my name. Dead weight, too emotional, need to protect assets before divorce. My marriage ended before I even reached the bottom of the screen. After he left for a meeting, I drove to a park near Lake Union and sat alone in the rain until my coat soaked through completely. I replayed every moment I blamed myself for our marriage falling apart, every apology, every compromise, every time I tried becoming smaller so Everett would stay. Then something inside me finally snapped into focus. Everett didn't cheat because he was unhappy. He cheated because admiration was the only thing he truly loved. The next morning, I sat across from Evelyn Granger while she reviewed my case quietly. When she finally looked up, her expression softened. "Your grandmother's cottage and trust assets may qualify as separate inherited property if they remained solely in your name. But if your husband is already planning strategy, we move carefully." Rain slid down the office windows behind her. I stared at it for a long moment. I do not want revenge. Evelyn folded her hands calmly. "Then what do you want?" I took a slow breath. "I want to leave before he destroys the last part of me he hasn't already touched."
Chapter 3. For the first few days after filing for divorce, I moved through the penthouse like someone quietly preparing for a funeral. Not for my marriage, for the version of myself that spent years begging to be loved correctly. Everett barely came home anymore. When he did, he moved around me like I was temporary furniture left behind after staging an expensive house for sale. He stayed on his phone constantly. Texts lit up his screen late into the night. Brielle's name flashed across it so often that eventually I stopped feeling shocked every time I saw it. I just felt tired. I packed slowly, not because I was unsure, because most of the things inside that penthouse no longer felt connected to me. The designer bags Everett bought after arguments stayed untouched in the closet. The diamond bracelet from our 10th anniversary stayed locked in its box beside dozens of gifts that always felt more like transactions than affection. I only packed things that felt real. My sketchbooks, my grandmother's recipes, old photographs from before Everett became someone I had to survive instead of someone I loved. One Thursday evening, Everett walked into the bedroom while I was folding sweaters into a suitcase. At first, he laughed. "What is this supposed to be?" I zipped the suitcase calmly. "I filed for divorce." The smile disappeared immediately. "You are serious?" "Yes." For a second, he just stared at me. Then his jaw tightened. "You went through my laptop." Not husband cheating, not marriage ending. That was the part he cared about. You were planning a future with another woman. You invaded my privacy. I almost laughed because it sounded unbelievable hearing him say it out loud. Everett stepped closer. "You have no idea how unstable this makes you look." There it was. Unstable, paranoid, emotional. He had spent years slowly rewriting reality until my reactions sounded crazier than his behavior. "You are making a huge mistake," he said. I picked up another sweater. "No, I made the mistake years ago." That was when his face changed. Not sadness, humiliation. Everett could handle an unhappy wife. What he could not handle was a wife choosing to leave him first. "You are not thinking clearly." I stayed quiet. His voice sharpened. "You honestly think you're going to survive out there without me?" I grabbed the suitcase handle. "Watch me." Something cold flashed across his expression. "You have been out of the industry for years. Nobody is waiting to hire you, Serafina." I walked toward the hallway. "You are too emotional to survive on your own." Then came the line that finally killed whatever love I still had left for him. "You stopped being interesting a long time ago." For a second, I actually felt the words hit my chest physically. Then something strange happened. Instead of breaking me, they exhausted me. I realized I didn't want his approval anymore. I wanted distance. I stepped into the elevator while Everett kept talking behind me. "You'll come back when reality hits you." The doors closed before I answered. Outside, Seattle smelled like cold rain and wet pavement. I loaded my suitcase into the trunk of my car and sat there gripping the steering wheel for a long moment. My hands were shaking badly, not because I wanted to stay, because I had spent so many years afraid of Everett being angry with me that leaving him felt physically wrong. That fear had shaped my entire personality without me noticing. The drive to Harbor Pine, Oregon took most of the day. Gray coastline slowly replaced city traffic. The farther I got from Seattle, the quieter my thoughts became. By the time I reached the cottage, the sky had turned silver over the ocean. My grandmother's house looked smaller than I remembered. The white paint had faded from years of salt air. Ivy crawled up the porch rails. Half the garden had disappeared beneath weeds. But standing there with cold wind hitting my face, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Space. No investors, no pretending, no waiting for Everett's moods to decide what kind of night I was allowed to have. Inside the cottage smelled of cedar, dust, and ocean air. Furniture sat beneath white sheets. The old grandfather clock near the staircase had stopped years ago. I opened every window, despite the cold. Waves crashed below the cliffs outside. That first night, I slept harder than I had in years. Then I woke up at 3 in the morning, panicking because I thought I heard Everett's car in the driveway. My chest tightened instantly. I actually whispered sorry out loud before realizing there was nobody there. That scared me more than the affair ever did. Even alone, my body still expected punishment. Over the next week, I started rebuilding the cottage slowly. I scrubbed kitchen counters, repainted the front door blue, fixed cabinet hinges, sorted through dusty attic boxes. The work exhausted me physically, but every repaired drawer and cleaned window made me feel slightly more human again. One afternoon, while pulling weeds in the garden, I found rose bushes nearly strangled beneath thick ivy vines. The roses underneath were still alive, barely. I spent almost 2 hours cutting ivy away carefully while dirt stained my jeans and my hands started aching. Then I suddenly remembered my grandmother kneeling beside these same bushes years ago. "Roses need room to breathe, sweetheart." At the time, I barely listened. Now, the memory hit so hard, it nearly made me cry. Maybe people needed room to breathe too. Maybe I spent so long trying to keep Everett comfortable that I forgot what emotional oxygen even felt like. A few days later, I forced myself to interview at Pearson Shore's studio near the Harbor Pine Marina. I almost turned around twice before walking inside. Nolan Pierce flipped quietly through my portfolio while I sat across from him, trying not to panic. Years of Everett dismissing my work had trained me to expect disappointment before anyone even spoke. Instead, Nolan looked up slowly.
These designs are incredible." I blinked. "Really?" He nodded. "Most people know trends. You actually know how spaces should feel." I had to look away for a second because I could feel tears threatening again. Not because of praise, because I realized how long it had been since anyone saw value in me without wanting something in return. That same week, Evelyn called while I was repainting cabinets. "Everett wants to settle quickly," she said. I paused mid-brushstroke. "Why?" She paused. "He thinks you're emotionally overwhelmed and eager to disappear quietly. He wants the penthouse and primary investment accounts." I looked around the kitchen. "What about the cottage?" A pause. "He considers it worthless." For the first time in weeks, I smiled. Later that night, I found a county envelope shoved between old mail near the front door. Property assessment paperwork, updated coastal zoning notices. I barely understood half of it, but one number near the bottom made my stomach tighten. The land value had increased dramatically. I folded the paper slowly. Interesting. Meanwhile, Brielle's social media became impossible to avoid. Champagne dinners, engagement ring selfies, wedding dress appointments in Manhattan, captions about fresh starts and finally being chosen. She looked genuinely happy, like she believed she had won something valuable. One afternoon, while painting the porch railing blue, I suddenly realized I had gone 3 straight days without thinking about Everett. That realization felt bigger than I expected. Then my phone rang. Dana Holloway. I answered reluctantly. Her voice exploded through the speaker immediately. "Oh my God, please tell me you already heard." "Heard what?" A pause. "Everett is marrying Brielle in New York." For the first time since leaving Everett, hearing his name no longer felt like swallowing glass. That surprised me more than the news itself. Dana kept talking excitedly through the phone about the wedding at the plaza in Manhattan, the guest list packed with investors, the custom floral installations flown in from Europe, the articles already appearing in society blogs about Everett Cole's glamorous second act. I leaned against the porch railing with blue paint drying across my fingers while ocean wind pushed cold air through my sweater. It all sounded exhausting. "Are you still there?" Dana asked carefully. "Yeah. Are you okay?" I looked out toward the cliffs below the cottage. "I think I finally am." After we hung up, I expected something dramatic to happen. A breakdown, rage, jealousy, some delayed grief exploding through me now that Everett was replacing me so publicly. Instead, I picked up my paintbrush again and finished the railing before sunset. That was when I realized healing is sometimes very quiet. Sometimes it looks like continuing your day without the person who once controlled your emotions, noticing they no longer can. Meanwhile, Everett was building his wedding like a performance. Dana kept feeding me updates whether I wanted them or not. Private tastings, designer tuxedo fittings, a ballroom covered in white orchids. Brielle posting engagement photos with captions about fresh starts and finally finding real love. The entire thing felt less like a marriage and more like Everett trying to win a competition nobody else realized existed. At Pierce and Shore Studio, work kept getting busier. Nolan trusted me with more client presentations. One afternoon, while reviewing coastal renovation plans together, Nolan glanced at me across the conference table. "You seem lighter lately." I almost laughed at that, because lighter was not exactly the word. Less afraid, maybe? "I sleep better now," I admitted. Nolan nodded once. "A peaceful nervous system changes everything." That sentence stayed with me all afternoon, because he was right. I had spent so many years monitoring Everett's moods that my body forgot what calm even felt like. Some nights at the cottage, I still caught myself listening for anger that was not there. A slammed door, footsteps, my phone buzzing with criticism. Then I would remember I was alone and safe. Meanwhile, cracks had apparently started forming beneath Everett's perfect new life. A few days before the wedding, Dana called while I was replanting roses near the cliffside. "You know Brielle is freaking out, right?" I brushed dirt from my hands. Why would I know that? One of Everett's assistants quit after the rehearsal tasting dinner. I sat back on my heels. What happened? Dana lowered her voice dramatically. He lost his mind because the hotel brought out the wrong champagne label. I closed my eyes because I could picture it perfectly. Everett standing in a luxury dining room with that cold, controlled anger spreading across his face. He embarrassed the staff in front of everyone, Dana continued. Apparently, Brielle tried calming him down and he snapped at her too. For a second, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Because Brielle had fallen in love with the polished version of Everett, the charming executive who made her feel chosen and admired. She had not yet fully met the man underneath. The wedding happened on a gray Saturday afternoon in Manhattan. At nearly the exact same time, I stood on a cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean, wrapped in my grandmother's old wool coat. Wind whipped my hair across my face while waves crashed violently below the rocks. Somewhere across the country, Everett was probably standing beneath crystal chandeliers, smiling for photographers, beside a woman young enough to still confuse attention with love. And somehow, standing there above the ocean, I realized I no longer hated him. That shocked me, not because he deserved forgiveness, because hating him required energy I didn't want to keep wasting. So I closed my eyes and finally said the words I think part of me had been carrying for years. I release you. The wind carried the sentence away immediately. For the first time in a very long time, I felt completely still inside myself. A week later, Arthur Bellamy arrived at the cottage carrying lemon pastries from Harbor Pine Bakery and looking too entertained with himself. "You look suspiciously cheerful," I told him. Arthur smiled. "I attended a wedding reception." I poured coffee slowly. "What did you do?" Technically, I only corrected a misunderstanding. That answer alone made me nervous. Arthur settled into one of the kitchen chairs while rain tapped softly against the windows. The event was exactly what you would expect. Expensive flowers, rich people pretending not to judge each other, Everett walking around like a man accepting an award for replacing his wife with a younger model. That sounded painfully accurate. Arthur took a sip of coffee. At one point, Everett gave a speech about new beginnings, said losing the wrong person sometimes leads you towards your real future. I stared out toward the ocean. Of course he did. Later, while he was speaking with investors, I mentioned how unfortunate it was that he let his most valuable asset walk away. I looked back at him sharply. "You said that out loud?" "I certainly did." My stomach tightened. "What happened?" Arthur's smile widened slightly. Everett laughed and asked if I meant the shack in Oregon. I closed my eyes briefly, because that sentence would hurt Everett more than discovering the actual value ever could. Public humiliation was the one thing his ego could never survive. Arthur stirred cream into his coffee. It got worse after that. One investor quietly asked another whether Everett missed other obvious opportunities too. There it was, the real damage. Not financial, reputational. I could suddenly picture Everett realizing the room no longer saw him as impressive. They saw him as careless. According to Arthur, Everett started drinking heavily afterwards. Brielle spent most of the reception trying to calm him down while pretending everything still looked perfect. Then someone accidentally served the wrong champagne again. This time, Everett exploded. He screamed at a waiter loud enough for half the ballroom to hear. Brielle grabbed his arm and Everett shoved her hand away hard enough for her to stumble backward. A guest near the dance floor had already been recording. Arthur looked at me carefully over the rim of his coffee cup. The video was online by Monday morning. I stared out the window toward the cliffs while rain rolled slowly down the glass. For years, Everett taught me silence. He never imagined silence could quietly survive long enough to watch him destroy himself.
Everett's life did not explode overnight. It unraveled slowly, the same way our marriage had. At first, he tried controlling the damage. Public statements, carefully worded explanations, calls to investors pretending the wedding video had been exaggerated online. But once wealthy people sense weakness, loyalty disappears fast. Financial blogs reposted the footage for days. Clips of Everett screaming at hotel staff spread across social media beside headlines questioning his judgment and professionalism. Someone slowed down the exact moment he shoved Brielle's hand away during the reception. That clip spread the fastest. By the following week, Cole and Marwick Capital placed Everett on temporary leave while the board opened an internal review. Then, clients started leaving. Quietly at first, then all at once. The same investors who once fought for dinner reservations beside Everett suddenly stopped returning his calls. Dana told me one longtime client transferred nearly $80 million to another firm within 48 hours after the video circulated. Apparently, one investor asked during a private meeting something that kept echoing through Everett's office afterward. If Cole missed something that obvious in his own life, what else has he missed? That question damaged him more than the scandal itself, because Everett built his entire identity around appearing smarter than everyone else in the room. 2 weeks later, he resigned. Officially, it was mutual. Nobody believed that. Meanwhile, life inside the Manhattan penthouse became uglier by the day. At first, Brielle stayed, probably because leaving immediately would have made the marriage look ridiculous. She kept posting smiling photos online for another few weeks, rooftop dinners, expensive wine, captions about fresh starts and protecting peace. But the captions slowly disappeared. Then the pictures did too. Dana heard from someone in New York that Everett had started drinking heavily by noon most days. He snapped at waiters, picked fights over nothing. One night, he screamed at Brielle because she answered a phone call while he was talking. Another night, he accused her of ruining his reputation simply by existing in the wedding video beside him. That was when Brielle finally understood the truth I spent years learning. Everett did not actually love people. He loved admiration, and once someone stopped making him feel admired, he turned cruel almost automatically. 3 months after the wedding, Brielle quietly moved out of the penthouse. Everett ended up alone in the same rooms where I once spent years trying to earn basic kindness from him. The strange part was that by then, I no longer felt satisfaction watching him collapse. Mostly, I felt distance, because my life had finally started becoming mine again. At Pierce & Shore Studio, Nolan officially made me partner that spring. The first morning I walked past the new sign outside the marina office and saw my own name beside his, I actually stopped in the middle of the sidewalk. Pierce, Shore, and Vale. Nolan opened the front door holding coffee. "You planning to stare at it all morning?" I laughed softly. "Maybe a little." He handed me the second coffee. "You earned it." For years, Everett made compliments feel expensive, like affection had to be earned through perfect behavior. Healthy people did not love that way. That realization changed me almost as much as leaving him did. Back at the cottage, life settled into something gentle and steady. The walls were freshly painted, the windows stayed open whenever weather allowed. Barney followed me from room to room like an oversized shadow with golden fur and bad hips. I adopted him from the Harbor Pine Rescue Shelter after he refused to stop sitting beside me every time I volunteered there. The shelter employee warned me he struggled with abandonment. I remember smiling sadly. So did I. By spring, the roses along the stone wall finally bloomed again. Deep red flowers stretched across the garden beneath the Oregon sunlight, while ocean wind carried salt air through the yard. Some mornings I drank coffee on the porch, watching Barney chase gulls across the grass while waves crashed below the cliffs. For the first time in years, peace stopped feeling temporary. That same summer, I created a small scholarship fund for female interior design students through the Harbor Pine Arts Foundation. Nothing enormous, just enough to help women who reminded me of the younger version of myself,
talented, hopeful, still believing love would never require self-erasure. Then, one rainy Thursday evening, Everett called from an unknown number. I almost ignored it. Something told me not to. When I answered, silence filled the line for several seconds before he finally spoke. "Sarah." His voice sounded different, smaller somehow. "What do you want, Everett?" Another silence. Then he exhaled shakily. "You were the only person who ever really loved me." Years ago, hearing that would have shattered me. Now it only made me tired. Because even after everything, Everett still spoke about love like something valuable mainly because he no longer had access to it. I stayed quiet. Then he finally said the real thing underneath the performance. "I do not know how to do this without you." There it was. Not regret, dependency. At that moment, I understood something painful and freeing at the same time. I had spent years confusing being needed with being loved. Everett's voice cracked slightly. "We could start over. I could move to Oregon. We could build something together again." As he spoke, I looked around the cottage. Morning sunlight stretched across the wooden floors. Barney slept beside my feet, twitching softly in a dream. Outside, wind moved through the roses, blooming along the cliffside garden. The entire room felt peaceful in a way my marriage never had. And suddenly, the idea of letting Everett back into this life felt unbearable. "You do not need me, Everett." Silence. "You need to learn to be alone." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I ended the call. I stood there afterward waiting for guilt to arrive. It never did. A year later, my life barely resembled the one I lived in Seattle. The cottage felt warm and alive again. Pierce, Shore, and Vale continued growing faster than we expected. Barney still slept beside the porch every afternoon beneath streaks of sunlight crossing the deckboards. And every spring, the roses came back stronger. People love revenge stories because they think justice always looks dramatic. Public humiliation, screaming fights, someone losing everything all at once. But honestly, I never destroyed Everett. I just stopped saving him from himself. And if you've ever made yourself smaller just to keep someone from leaving, remember this. The right person will never ask you to disappear so they can feel bigger. How many women spend years mistaking survival for love? Sometimes the quietest revenge is simply choosing yourself again.